Welcome all to Issues with Noah Rothman on Two-Way. I am your host, Noah Rothman. So, for whatever they were worth, the primaries are, for all intents and purposes, over. Presidential election almost nobody wanted will soon be upon us. I say almost because, while utter disgust typifies just about the reaction of 7 in 10 Americans, it doesn't describe the partisans who turned out in their respective primaries to vote for Joe Biden and Donald Trump and a rematch. Donald Trump remains just about as unpopular as he was when he grudgingly left office, but voters seem very dissatisfied, perhaps more dissatisfied, with Joe Biden's tenure. Moreover, they seem to have reached an entirely rational and justified conclusion that the president just isn't up to the job, not the one he occupies today, and certainly not one he would occupy 4 years from now. So that's where we're at. The candidate most voters believe cannot perform the job, and another candidate most voters believe has disqualified himself from the job, at least according to a Quinnipiac University poll from 2023. It's not a pleasant choice, but it is a dramatic one. Not only do we have very few historical parallels to help us navigate the current presidential contest, we have very few tools to help us forecast how this contest will affect down-ballot races at the state and Senate level, state and federal level. These two presidential candidates are forging entirely new pathways, in part because the respective parties, Republican and Democratic alike, have renovated their coalitions over the last couple of years. Republicans, for example, used to rely, before 2006, on a very educated, affluent, suburbanite electorate that was, while small, could be depended on to turn out and vote. They've shed that coalition in favor of a broader working class coalition, which is bigger in number, but much harder to motivate to go out to the polls. Likewise, Democrats have shed the last vestiges of the New Deal coalition. No longer do they rely on working class voters, the downtrodden, those who are beset by forces beyond their control. Their coalition is much more degree heavy. A lot of them are degree holders, and Democrats seem to know this because they routinely entice them to go out to the polls with sops like forgiving student debt and elevating boutique issues like the threat to democracy and transgenderism and what have you, which speak very much to highly educated voters, but not necessarily to those who are looking out for their pocketbooks. So this is why this is an extremely delicate situation, a hard to navigate situation, which is why I'm going to ask my two guests to help me out today. And I'm very thrilled to welcome two people I very sincerely admire: the editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon, the host of the Ink-Stained Wretches podcast, alongside her co-host, Chris Steyerwalt, Eliana Johnson. Hi, Eliana.
Hi, Noah.
And Meghan McCain, herself a very accomplished commentator and television personality, and the host of her own podcast, Meghan McCain Has Entered the Chat. Hi, Meghan.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you both. So I want to start tonight with something that I've been struggling to reconcile over the last couple of days. We have polling that demonstrates that in a head-to-head matchup between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, Donald Trump can count on about 90% of the vote. Before the primaries, after the primaries, 90% of Republicans, as it were, will be coming home to him. They have no problem with Donald Trump. And that's about where the conventional wisdom would say he needs to be. You've got to have about 90% of your own party. At the same time, we have raw votes in primaries that include defections. Republicans are defecting. And contrary to what the cynics might say, Democratic cynics, Republican cynics, everybody who thinks the Republican Party is just too far gone in the Trump mold, we have in South Carolina, it was about 30% of self-described Republicans voted for Nikki Haley. In Michigan, where there was a competitive Democratic contest, and a lot of Democrats voted in that one and did not participate in the Republican one, you had about 26% of the vote voting against Donald Trump. In a competitive contest in where we had exit polls in North Carolina and Virginia on Super Tuesday, where there was no saturation of the airwaves and no priming of the voters, really, as they were in the early primary states, you saw Nikki Haley garner about the high teens of Republican votes. These are gettable Republican voters for Donald Trump, but they are not his yet. And yet we have polling that suggests these Republicans want to come home. Eliana, help me understand what I'm seeing here. My guess is that Republicans aspire to come home. They really want to come home, as it were, to vote for Donald Trump. They're just not there yet and need a reason to get there. Am I misreading this? Or is the polling, or rather the primary voting that showed a fair amount of Republicans defecting from Donald Trump's movement just entirely illusory. They're trying to send a message and they don't care whether it's received.
I don't think it's actually all that different from the 2016 primaries, where Trump only garnered 30% of the Republican vote, but the field was divided. And in the end, Republicans did come back around to Donald Trump. And Nikki Haley, I think people ask the question, why does she continue running? She's not going to get the nomination, was trying to drive home the point that this is still very much a party divided. At this point, we don't really know. The other factor, one that you didn't mention, was that many of these where she performed well, garnering 30 or 40% of the vote, were open primaries in which Democrats could vote. And we do know that a lot of Democrats who were dissatisfied with Biden's performance crossed over to vote in the Republican primary. And those people, we know those people won't be voting for Trump.
Those are Biden voters for sure.
Of course. And so I do, and the other open question is, who will Trump's vice presidential nominee be? And I think that is something that could bring home Republicans to Trump in the end. It's the reason he chose Mike Pence last time, somebody who could reassure nervous Republican voters. This time, there are people who I think he could choose to reassure Republican voters this time around. However, his behavior in 2020 on January 6th, I guess that was 2021, was not reassuring. But if he chose someone like a Katie Britt, who was not offensive to many Republican voters, rather than say a Vivek Ramaswamy or a Ben Carson, who made people nervous, a Nikki Haley, a Katie Britt, a Tim Scott, I think that would help him on the margins. But we are talking about the margins here.
Right. That would appeal to us. So I've been trying to suss out clues to assess who is a Republican voter, a gettable voter, and who is one of these disaffected former Republicans or even dyed-in-the-wool Democrats who will definitely vote for Biden. And it's hard to tell in the exit polling, but you can find it if they disapprove of the economy, if they're angry with the state of affairs in the country, if they disapprove of Joe Biden, and first of all, they identify as Republican or conservative. If you find those Republican voters who match that profile, I would say those are gettable Republican voters. And it's not a majority of Nikki Haley's vote, but it's probably close to a plurality, 30, 40%, depending on the state. And yet they're not showing up in polls. We could do a little bit of deep stakes, Meghan, because Eliana broached it. Her premise is, I think, the right one. Is would these candidates who, would the type of person who would appeal to us, who would satisfy us and soothe frayed nerves on our end. But the candidates who are vying for this right now are demonstrating that what they think Donald Trump wants to hear from them is that they would do what Mike Pence wouldn't have done on January 6th. They would decertify an election. I'm talking about Elise Stefanik, J.D. Vance, to a lesser extent, Tim Scott and Doug Burgum, both of whom were asked this question, would you do what Mike Pence wouldn't? And they very studiously avoided the question to a point of being very conspicuous. It suggests that that's what they know. They're close to this process. They know that's what Donald Trump wants to hear. How likely do you think it is that we're going to get a Tim Scott or a Doug Burgum or a Katie Britt versus somebody like an Elise Stefanik or a J.D. Vance who would do whatever it takes to get close to that kind of power?
Doug Burgum really surprises me in that, because I actually interviewed him for my podcast and he seemed pretty anti-Trump at the time. He seemed sort of, I guess, sorry, my audio for my baby is on the side, and I'm sorry, it's very distracting. I'll turn it off in a second. But
Okay.
no, I think that he seemed very anti-Trump at the time, and sort of like, I'm running to be an alternative because times have to change. So it's always interesting when someone like that turns around and then is saying that they wouldn't necessarily decertify January 6th. Even if Trump wants a Vivek Ramaswamy or wants an Elise Stefanik, you still have to remember that Trump has a very evolved and experienced group of people running his campaign this time. Susie Wiles is very well established and has done a very good job up until this point of keeping Trump reined in as much as possible. So if they are smart, which I think his team is, and I think Trump is not, he will end up choosing a Katie Britt, a more moderate person, even though I was telling a friend earlier, she kind of gives me like Palin vibes a little bit. Like she's so untested, just recently elected to Alabama. Nobody knows anything about her. It's kind of like when you put all your hopes in one basket of someone who's completely untested, trust me, it can be tenuous. So I'm very interested to see who he ends up picking, but it's funny to watch the like dance of different people trying to like impress Trump as much as possible and like debase themselves. Tim Scott being the one that broke my heart the most up until this point.
Stick with you, Megan, because while we're talking about the unity front, the reestablishing Republican unity after this very fractious primary in which a very small portion of the Republican voting base may have some hard feelings, but we're talking about the margins, as Eliana said, and that matters. I'm going to go to you because not since Russian warship go F yourself have we had a slogan catch fire like your direct quote, no peace, bitch.
I know, it's so weird. It's gotten so much attention. And I think every once in a while people forget that like I'm from Arizona. I'm not raised in DC and I haven't been like focus grouped into like oblivion. So
But we should explain what happened here.
Okay,
what this
so
was
what
about.
happened was the woman running for Senate, Carrie Lake, who is a woman who also ran for governor, who is, if you don't know, she's like just MAGA and in person intensified. Like she actually did an event where she put a red carpet on sand that she was vacuuming for Trump to come, like completely debasing herself and turning herself into like the most MAGA candidate in the world. And in the meantime, she imitated Trump and said really disparaging things about my dad and my mom and me. And she ended up losing Arizona because like 10 days before her election for governor, she told McCain voters that if there are any McCain voters in the room to get the hell out. And then she ended up losing by about 14%, which polling wise is about the same amount of people in Arizona who identify still as McCain voters. So it's an interesting conundrum. And now that she's running for Senate, I guess her team has realized that she has to appeal to moderate Republicans and independents and is trying to sort of like make amends. She went on a radio
She
show.
said that explicitly. She's reading the subtext. Quote, I am actively trying to court all Republicans, whether they are, MAGA Republicans somewhere in the middle or traditional Republicans. And she's doing a terrible job of it.
Yeah, she went on a radio show and said that the stuff she said about my dad was a joke. And she said like very disparaging things, which I don't feel like the need to repeat right now. So you could just look it up if you want to. And unfortunately for her, the radio host that she interviewed, I don't think she realized that I'm friends with them. And then she wrote this really weird thing on social media about how we're like both moms and like, her dad died of cancer too. And I just tweeted back, and I'm sorry to be vulgar on your very esteemed show, Noah, but I tweeted no peace, bitch, because I couldn't think of anything else more succinct. And then yesterday, Nikki Haley's campaign manager tweeted the same thing to Carrie Lake because Carrie Lake had said disparaging things about Nikki Haley and used her birth name Nimrata, which is seen as like a dig at her not being an authentic person. So that's a very long, convoluted way to explain what happened.
No, not at all. And that's Eliana. This is obviously her looking at data and saying, oh God, I actually need these people. And I just kind of have to appeal to them. But in a Trump-like way, it doesn't seem like she can maintain that level of discipline for very long, which is kind of surprising because she is a disciplined campaigner. I was impressed, frankly, with her 2022 run and thought she would pull it out. She had only narrowly lost in the end. But Eliana, what does this tell you about the unity push? And we're talking about a swing state here and a statewide race where now the candidate is facing a head-to-head after Kyrsten Sinema has dropped out of the race, and she's acting like she's behind the 8 ball. What does this tell us about the state of play nationally? It tells me, I'm going to answer my own question. It tells me that I don't really believe the head-to-head polling, very early though it is, that Republicans are as on board with Trump and the Trumpified Republican Party and on the margins as the polling suggests they are.
Look, I think it's sort of hard to talk about polls right now when we're so far from the election.
Right.
So much is going to happen in this race between now and then, starting with the State of the Union address tonight, where the president, who's 81 years old, is going to have to stand up and give a speech for 45 minutes or an hour. That may be an inflection point, but there are going to be several such points between now and then. We'll see what happens with the Donald Trump's criminal trials between now and then, the selection of a running mate, which we talked about. So I do think we're, over analyzing polling at this point with so much ground left to cover, because we like to seize on data and parse it. Look, either way, this is going to be a very close race. The country is so closely divided that there are no more, Reagan blowouts where 49 states go one way and Minnesota goes another. That's just not going to happen anymore. The election is going to hinge on 4 or 5 states, and those states will go one way or the other on very narrow margins.
I agree with all that, with the exception of, because we only have polls, and that's the one thing that we can use to assess the state of play nationally, is that the Democratic coalition is very fragile. It is held together by twine. And if the Republican Party were to have nominated somebody more acceptable to a general electorate like a Nikki Haley, or even a Ron DeSantis for that matter, you would see that coalition just dissolve. It's probably not a 49 state landslide scenario, but it's a 300 plus electoral vote scenario for sure. Eliana, the Biden administration is going to do a lot of Donald Trump's work for it. They want to make the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which essentially establishes a series of relatively, by and large, just conservative boilerplate policy reforms. They want to make this a wedge issue, and they want to brand Donald Trump with it. Maybe there are excesses, again, on the margins of this thing, but by and large, this is a set of pretty boilerplate conservative reforms. Making that into a campaign issue, I think, is probably the fastest way to induce the kind of unity that the Biden campaign doesn't want to see, right? Or are they just kind of stuck on this very ploddingly unimaginative approach to campaigning, saying, oh, this kind of conservatism is heartless and cruel and blah, 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 just to animate the progressive base. The progressive base doesn't seem to be very animated, but that might do it for them. But at the same time, it risks creating the kind of repairing the damage that Donald Trump's approach to politics has done to his own coalition.
Look, I mean, they want to run on democracy and on January 6th. And really, this election should be a referendum on Biden, and they should be running on his accomplishments and on 4 more years of that. But they can't do that because he doesn't have very many accomplishments to run on. And the state of the country is not great. Even though they can point to various economic benchmarks, I don't think people are feeling it, starting with the state of our college campuses, which and the situation on the southern border. And I think it's going to be very hard for Biden to run on his record. So he has to run against Trump and against the January 6th, 2020 version of Trump. And that's why I think they're pointing to Heritage Foundation and who's going to be in the administration and how crazy it's all going to be. It'll be chaos once again. The trouble with that, I think, is that when people look back, and this has shown up in the polling, I don't think they remember, Trump himself was chaotic, but I don't think they remember their lives and the state of the country under Trump as being particularly chaotic. The world has gone to chaos under Biden, and that actually didn't happen under Trump.
No, there's actual profound Trump nostalgia. Some of it, I frankly think, is misplaced. And some of it's a little weird because even Trump himself says, remember those 3 years of my economy? Not 4 years. Doesn't talk about 2020. But when he's talking about the border and his approach to the border, he really is only talking about the pandemic era. That's when we had a crackdown on the border that was actually had measurable impacts on contacts at the border. Nevertheless, Eliana's point's absolutely right. Meghan, before we were starting today, you were talking about how just crushingly bored you are with the state of American politics. I don't blame you. I really don't. I think it's fascinating insofar as that it's not dynamic. It's not dynamic. It's not dramatic, but it is a retread. And that's probably how a lot of people feel.
Our friend Mary Catherine Ham says it's 2020, but older. And that's how I feel, is like it's 2020, but older and crankier. I think for all of us, like Eliana, you, me, like people who follow this, normally Super Tuesday is like a very exciting time. And other times I would have like had a party and invited all of you over and had like drinks and food so we could watch the polls come in. And I went to sleep early. Like I knew, you know, we all knew what was gonna happen. I voted and I even at the polls, I was just like, I don't know why I'm doing this. Like, I mean, I'm doing it because you know, it's important to vote no matter what. But when the woman was giving my ballot, I was like, I guess I'm doing this. Like, it just, you know, and I did ended up voting for Nikki Haley in protest, which, you know, made me feel good for about 10 seconds. And I think that's all that did. But it's hard. I mean, these candidates are so old and so controversial and so disliked. And what I'm fascinated by right now is this 19% of voters who are the double hate voters, who
Double
are the
haters.
ones who hate Trump and Biden. I guess I fit in that category as well, and where they're going to go. And if RFK Jr. is actually something that's going to be, if he can get on the ballot, if he's someone that's going to get legitimate attention. Van Jones was on CNN a few nights ago, and he was saying that we're not paying attention to him, that he's doing all these podcasts and he's doing all these like things that young people consume, all these, you know, media platforms, and that his campaign should be something to watch. I don't know if you guys agree with that. I don't know if I agree with that, but it's an interesting idea. But I don't know. I think, but I do think if you're the Biden campaign and you're the incumbent right now who ran on, I'm going to heal the soul of the nation and everything will be calm and cuddly and so much better with me. And this is what you've delivered. It's still shocking to me. Just one more thing, and I would love to hear your reaction. There was a response on MSNBC that went viral of all the basically famous MSNBC women making fun of people who thought that the border was the number one voting issue, just laughing at it and saying it's ridiculous. And the border is the number one issue for many people I know. And I don't understand how Democrats can't see clips like that and think that like these are things that get Trump elected. Laughing if you think that like a college student being murdered by an illegal immigrant who, you know, should have been deported, if that's hilarious to you, no wonder Trump's growing in popularity.
Absolutely, it is well said. And that speaks to the Democratic Party's new coalition, right? Which is very degree heavy, very top heavy with degree holders who are insulated from economic distress and the kind of personal insecurity that a lot of Americans are experiencing right now. To the double haters point that you mentioned, Megan, so it's kind of weird because Donald Trump is usually on the good side of that one. 2016 and 2020, double haters broke for Donald Trump, but according to the New York Times Siena poll, they're not breaking for Trump. Double haters break for Biden, even though he's deeply behind overall because a variety of other demographics have turned against him, up to and including in that poll the fact that there's no gender gap, that women break evenly for Joe Biden and Donald Trump. If that materializes on election day, I will put my mortgage up. But let's turn to Joe Biden. Because today is, as you said, State of the Union. We're recording this beforehand, so anything that happens is going to reach its sell-by date. So let's not focus on what matters most, which is his body language. If he can stand there and be cogent and competent and capable well past his bedtime. Let's focus on some of the policy stuff that he plans to pursue. The biggest headline today being the float, Eliana, of this humanitarian corridor to establish offshore aid via a makeshift port in the Gaza Strip. Now, the White House is saying this will not involve American boots on the ground necessarily, so who knows how this port will be constructed or manned, for example. Nevertheless, it exists as part of this campaign that the Biden administration is conducting to theatrically indict Israel for not providing enough aid to Palestinians. The notion that is being subtly retailed, which is inaccurate, so no one in the White House is actually saying it, is that the IDF isn't presiding over a very dangerous effort to disseminate aid via A, the Rafah crossing through Egypt, and B, crossing directly into Israeli territory where they inspect aid and they distribute it. And it's actually quite dangerous. Nevertheless, Eliana, what is the administration doing here?
I have absolutely no.
I mean, they know that Israel has to win, right? With all due alacrity. They've invested all this capital, political prestige, what have you, in Israel's victory. And yet every step of the way, they're attempting to undermine Israel and undermine its mission and therefore its own objective. What are they doing?
Well, look, they're throwing rhetorical chum to the far left while not really changing their policy up until today, where they say they're going to build a port no American troops. And the only problem, I read the Wall Street Journal piece about this, and they say the only issue that they haven't yet figured out is how they're actually going to get the aid into Gaza. They need Hamas to help disperse the aid in Gaza.
Of course, what other authority is there?
Exactly. But how exactly are they going to build this port without putting American troops on the ground? And then all of it will be stolen by Hamas. So I don't actually see how this comes to fruition or how it doesn't spawn. Let's say it does. I mean, they're going to have to somebody's going to have to be on the ground there building and monitoring this. And if it does actually come to fruition, I don't see how we don't get 10,000 news stories about Hamas skimming the aid. They say.
I see how we don't get the stories.
Joel, okay, but the Free Beacon's there to do the stories.
There you go.
They say, the UN's going to help us distribute the aid. Like, there have been no issues with that. I mean, the whole thing just strikes me as a total joke. And again, like, intended to be 5 lines in the State of the Union that MSNBC and CNN can talk about, more than an actual policy proposal that's going to become a serious reality on the ground there.
Meghan, we're not. No, absolutely. Meghan, we're not breaking any new ground here by saying, obviously, that this president and his administration are terrified of progressives who have turned entirely on Israel. And when they see it in the polls, they see their numbers sliding, and they see it sliding since October of 2023, and they see Israel. I see Iran, the same polls of them moving in the wrong direction vis-a-vis Israel's war, because everybody disapproves of Joe Biden's handling of the war, not just Democrats, but Republicans too. If you look at the numbers, Republicans have turned on Joe Biden on Israel, not necessarily because they don't like his support for Israel's mission necessarily, but because they don't like Joe Biden. They don't like anything he does, and they always say no. But at the same time, since the 10/7 massacre, we've had an eruption of violence across the region, including dozens and dozens of attacks on U.S. soldiers in Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, and the Houthi attacks on international shipping. The foremost expression of American hegemony is the protection of maritime navigation in the seas. And Joe Biden has responded to all of this, including the murder of 3 Americans and the wounding of 34 more in this attack in Jordan. And he's kind of responded lackadaisically to it. I see these polls moving in the wrong direction because the majority of Americans see a president who is behaving weakly and inviting weakness. And look, Americans don't vote on foreign policy, but it's Joe Biden's job approval ratings took a nosedive after the botched invasion or withdrawal from Afghanistan. They never recovered. And that's sort of what we're seeing here. Since 10/7, since November roughly, Donald Trump has opened up a pretty sizable lead in the head-to-head against Joe Biden, and I can't help but draw the connection between his weak response to a variety of attacks on U.S. personnel and interests and his polling. But the Biden people don't see it, so maybe I'm wrong. What do you think?
Well, I think it started in Afghanistan. That's always sort of like the original sin for me, is his horrible pullout in Afghanistan. And, the images of the people holding on to the planes and falling because they knew what Afghanistan was going to turn into when the Taliban came, and they would literally rather die hanging onto a plane than stay there and go through that. I mean, we see all the data and information coming out about starvation rates and people selling their children for food. And it's just like, the Biden administration doesn't care. The thing I always remember about Joe Biden is that he voted against killing Osama bin Laden and the SEAL Team 6 raid, which, has turned into a moment that is of great pride, great patriotism. I think of great, visceral satisfaction to many people, at least that I know in the military. And he wouldn't have wanted to take out the terrorists responsible for the worst domestic terror attack in American history. So I actually think the dirty secret about Joe Biden is much more of an isolationist than I even knew, and that I think that he had let on before he came into power. I agree. I think it's a big reason that's adding to his unpopularity, because it's obviously evident that Vladimir Putin is not scared of him, that our enemies are not scared of him, that he looks like a weak old president that, quite frankly, can be jerked around and have America jerked around. So I agree with you that I do believe it's impacting his poll numbers. Americans as a general whole, no matter what the squad or MSNBC or whatever wants to tell you, we are tough, we love America, and we like killing bad guys. And I think the idea that we're just going to be weak and be pushed around by murderous dictators and horrible terrorists is a really dangerous bet for the Democrats to make.
So, Eliana, the Biden administration doesn't seem to know that it needs Israel to win. The Biden administration doesn't seem to know that it needs inflation to go down either, at least according to one of the supposed proposal that's going to come from the president tonight, which is $5,000 credit for first-time home buyers and a credit for families selling starter homes, which I assume is a threshold price point, probably like 400,000 or something along those lines. This is crazy. Housing prices are high now because inventory is extremely tight. There's no homes on the market, and they're raising rates to discourage demand. And so they're going to respond to that by subsidizing demand, by making it easier for you to get into a marketplace where there's not enough stuff to buy. This is the definition of inflation. Too much money chasing after too few goods. That's it. And yet this administration can't help itself but pander at the expense of its foremost economic objective.
My head almost exploded when I saw that because we had the taxpayers subsidized COVID relief that caused inflation. And the whatever it was called, the Inflation Reduction Act that whatever that inaptly named Inflation Reduction Act that injected
the American Rescue Plan.
American Rescue Plan injected more money into the economy. Now they want all of this on the back of the taxpayer. Now on the back of the taxpayer, they want to give people $5,000 to go get into the housing market when we are trying to. We want to squeeze the housing market. Like we want it to be hard for people to buy homes right now. What we're seeing in the housing market right now is good.
Right. And that hurts, but that's the whole point, is why you don't want inflation, because everything you have to do to get inflation in check hurts a lot.
And all of this by injecting taxpayer money back into the economy. Crazy.
It's madness.
Crazy.
So,
and by the way, in the same way that the student loan forgiveness, I don't think has helped Biden. These things are not helping poor people. They're helping relatively affluent people whose votes Biden doesn't actually need at the expense of the actually needy, who more and more we see migrating to the Republican Party. Roy Teixeira of AEI had a very interesting piece on his Substack today saying there's no longer, polling shows there's no longer a real difference, a real racial difference in the lower middle class between minority voters and white voters. They're all Trump. They're all on the right now.
Yep.
That's fascinating. So yeah, I mean, it's turning what would be an intellectual exercise on the left into a real emotional exercise, because if you're being shafted like this, you have every right to feel aggrieved by it. And I think quite a lot of taxpayers are going to feel frustrated with this. So no one's going to hold you to it, but there is sort of the WB Frog effect here that Joe Biden has been courting, with the notion that he, could be maximally cogent and hyper energetic and in command and peak performance as long as no one's looking at him.
I know.
But when anybody who's remotely skeptical of that premise shows up, then all of a sudden he has Biden moments. Can't even call them senior moments anymore. They're Biden moments. The likelihood that he has one of those today, I think, is probably very small.
Can I just say, Biden has lowered my bar for what to expect of 80-plus-year-olds.
This is the premise,
every time
Eliana.
I see
Run with it.
An 80-year-old who's like completely with it, which is frequently, I'm like, man, you're 80 and you're so like the president can't even get out a sentence. But he's like radically lowered my bar for what to expect because his, deterioration is so apparent.
It's rapid. It's really rapid.
Yeah.
It really is. It's quite like it's amazing to watch even interviews from him 4 years ago. Like that he seems like a totally different person. I think the frustration I have is that I didn't go into this industry because I want to be a doctor and monitor someone's health. And I feel like me and the American public are being put in this position that we're like, is he going to be okay? Is he going to have another guy? And like, that is so not the role I want to have, nor should it be the role of the American public. And I also think it doesn't matter how many people go on TV, Jen Psaki and Karine Jean-Pierre and everyone, like, he was running circles around me. And I agree with you. If all these moments
it's humiliating.
but if this is happening, why is there never a camera around? ever. I would love to see this like hyper energized WWE Biden, but it only apparently happens when we're all not watching. But I'm actually nervous for him. Another thing that makes me nervous about the State of the Union tonight is like, if I actually thought like, what if he does something really, because it's on late, what if he stumbles in a really embarrassing way? And this is like late night fodder for other countries and our enemies. And I hate this position we're all being put in. It's really unfair.
I totally agree. It is a high risk, low reward situation. If he's lucky, no one will remember anything that happens tonight. That's a best
Yeah.
case scenario.
Yeah.
The worst case scenario is he has one of those moments. But as Eliana said, Meghan, the bar is really low, and he can probably clear it pretty easy. Get a shot of vitamin B in there, have a couple of cups of coffee, have the longest possible nap, show up at exactly 8:30.
Imagine what kind of meds they're giving him.
Yeah,
No,
I mean,
they got to be giving him something, some
better
kind
living
of
through chemistry. So
before
if
this.
he could clear that hurdle, at which point you will have a chorus of Democrats saying, "Guy's back. Man, is he back." You have not seen an astute performance like that in presidential history, and they will incept that narrative into the public. I don't know if it'll take or not, but it will be latched onto by Democrats and Biden supporters like flotsam in a shipwreck. It might be effective.
He messed up an interview with Ryan Seacrest on New Year's. Like, and Ryan Seacrest's question was like, how do you think things are going? Or like, what's your favorite part of 2023? And he couldn't answer it and he gaffed that. So it doesn't matter. Like, I think the press sometimes thinks the American public's really stupid or they're like paying absolutely no attention. Americans are very smart and they see in front of their eyes what they know is happening. And we all know. And again, I hate it more than anyone. I really, really makes me really uncomfortable to be put in a position where I'm monitoring our president's health. But he promised that he would be an interim president. I think that's why a lot of people are angry and frustrated too. He was always supposed to be just a 4-year, get us out of the Trump chaos, and then move on to someone else. And the idea of having an 86-year-old Joe Biden in office, I understand why so many people are voting for Trump. It's almost unfathomable to me. I mean, 86 is quite old. The median age for a lifespan of an American male is 76.
Yeah, don't remind me.
Sorry.
I'm getting up there myself. We only have about 10 minutes left, so I want to get to a fun story, as insofar as we have fun stories these days, and that involves the countdown for TikTok, which is rapidly counting down. Mike Gallagher, TikTok for TikTok. That's what I should have gone with. Good job, Eliana. So Mike Gallagher and Raja Krishnamurthy, Democrat, Republican, introduced a bill that's going to that would force the People's Republic of China owned firm ByteDance, which controls applications like TikTok, to divest TikTok, or this thing is going to be kicked off the App Store. No more TikTok. So today, we had a House Energy and Commerce Committee hearing on this bill, and lawmakers described and indeed played some of the audio for reporters demonstrating that they've been flooded by the comms shop. The TikTok comms shop has generated all these users and tell them, go berate your congressman, go emotionally blackmail your congressman. And that's exactly what they did. They told their members of Congress that I'm going to kill myself if you take away my TikTok. Like, they're deeply addicted to this thing, which, by the way, reinforces every argument against this product, that it's essentially foreign spyware that is designed to foster disunity, conspiratorial paranoia, addictive behaviors. They're all demonstrating it. And so this thing passes the House Energy and Commerce Committee unanimously, 50 votes. This does not happen. It seems as though TikTok has been sowing the seeds of its own destruction by lobbying members of Congress so hard against what they obviously don't want them to do, but nevertheless demonstrating that the validity of the arguments against this thing right before their eyes. It seems to have convinced all the members of the House who were otherwise predisposed to be like, we should take a hands-off approach here. Eliana.
This was amazing. I mean, TikTok mounted a massive political disinformation effort aimed at the United States Congress because they were telling the users of their app that Congress was on the precipice of banning TikTok, which is not what this bill would do. It presents ByteDance, the CCP-controlled company, with a choice and gives them 6 months. It is up to the CCP whether TikTok will be banned in the United States. And as a result, members of Congress were flooded with phone calls, as you mentioned, teenagers threatening suicide. Beyond that, it's worth noting TikTok has flooded the airways with television ads. One of them features a nun talking about the way she's used TikTok. The audacity of that company to feature a nun, and the audacity of that nun when China is ruthlessly suppressing Christianity, and the audacity of TikTok to make this an issue of free speech when it campaigns in this country, I think shows precisely what this country is up against with the CCP, because they are playing on and using our own freedoms against us, ones that they ruthlessly suppress in China.
You can feel the tide turning against this thing because Democrats were kind of skeptical about this, and conservatives, libertarian conservatives as well.
Yeah, the Club for Growth is against this ban on the right.
For reasons that I am not unsympathetic to in the abstract. But you can definitely see the tide turning against this, in particular among Democrats. I wanted to bring this to your attention. Chris Hayes, MSNBC host, noted after Peter Hamby and other reporters said, look, this is evidence, obviously, that TikTok can and does manipulate American public attitudes and behaviors. And Chris Hayes replies, yeah, he kind of agrees with that and says, well, TikTok is massively shaping public opinion and discourse. I'm pretty sure in a right-wing direction. First of all, that's crazy. There's no evidence of that. In fact, he was saying something very similar, I think, several weeks ago. But it's evidence of the rationalization that they're talking themselves into. However, they need to get to the ban TikTok point. They're just not. They don't want to seem uncool. They don't want to seem they're not with it. They're not hip. But they got to ban TikTok. Meghan, you have kids, or at least you have a daughter.
Yeah.
We learned
TikTok, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the story. So we learned pretty early on in our naivete as very young parents, you don't let the kids surf YouTube. Recipe for disaster. These apps are flooded with absolute trash that have this like almost unique hypnotic quality to keep kids engaged in surfing, and it's mood altering. It really does actually affect their behavior. So you learn really quickly to limit and strictly monitor user-generated content on sites like these. So I have an instinctual revulsion to the idea of government stepping in and serving as a guidepost for parents. I don't like that on an instinctual level. But it sure sounds like some of these parents would benefit from the guidance provided by this committee if they were to limit at least the access of their minor children to this application, especially if it is convincing them to have suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts. Is there a government role here, not just a national security role? I think that's frankly, I think that is an element of the debate that is used as a smokescreen to do what more interventionist lawmakers would like to do, which is to take something that is objectively harmful and extirpate it from society.
Yeah, I mean, if it's all fine, why does China limit the amount of time their kids are allowed to use TikTok? I think it's like 16 minutes and then it turns off, and maybe 9. You also see the huge difference between the algorithm, what it promotes in China versus what it promotes in the United States of America. You also just have to look at data on TikTok about Israel and Palestine and just see you cannot find something pro-Israel on TikTok. And I know because I go on TikTok on occasions. That's my confession to you. That's very shameful to admit. But I will.
During the pandemic, my wife and I actually perused it on a pretty regular basis, and it was quite funny. But at no point did we ever download this thing onto our devices. We had to use external devices.
It's very addictive and it's awful. And I will say that, I'm not on it all the time or anything like that, but I did use it because so many colleagues, so many people I know were putting content on it. And I was like, well, okay. And there's actually a political analyst that I follow who's just primarily on TikTok that I really like. So that's where it becomes tricky. I'm happy to have TikTok removed. I can live without it. But then the president has to get off TikTok too, because President Biden is now on TikTok. So what kind of message is that sending to everyone? And I just find the hypocrisy of people not seeing, again, particularly with the Israel-Gaza war, the vast amount of anti-Semitism that was spread on TikTok, especially in the days aftermath of October 7th, to be just completely disingenuous if you don't if you don't understand that and show that.
Meghan, that's such a great point about the president getting on TikTok to reach the youth.
Yeah.
High
When government
likelihood
employees, nobody had government devices, it's banned.
it's banned.
Cannot access it on a government device.
Yeah. So what is the likelihood this president is compelled to sign this thing? What do you think? This thing passes? President has to sign it?
I think he
He's
will.
not going to veto it.
No.
Meghan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think he does too.
This is a hopeful note. We're ending on a hopeful note. Guys, thank you so much for being here. Eliana, why don't you tell us what our users can see today on the Washington Free Beacon? I especially enjoyed the mashup of reporters melting down over the Supreme Court's decision to allow Donald Trump to get on the Colorado primary ballot.
Well, our lead story today is about the Biden administration flouting federal law by refusing to take DNA samples of the illegal immigrants coming over the border. And we look forward to, we'll have Matt Continetti's analysis of the State of the Union tomorrow, and a piece next week on the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education's investigation into Middlebury College.
Very good. And Meghan McCain has entered the chat podcast. Who's our latest guest?
I had Steve Kornacki on today, and I cannot remember. I apologize. I cannot remember who's on next week, but it's always good. I apologize. But yeah, it's really fun. You have been on. Eliana, you were actually on my list to come on too if you ever have time. And
I'd love to.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And thank you both. And I just want to apologize to you and your viewers. Anyone who has children, you have those like little audios, you can listen to them cry. And I accidentally left mine on. So if you heard a little bit, that's what it was. And then when I went off, I was turning it off. So I apologize.
I didn't, but this is how raw we are. This is
yeah, it's a real show.
Real stuff. It's real stuff. We're doing real time. Thank you guys both so much. And thank you for watching. You have been listening and watching Issues with Noah Rothman on Two-Way. I'd very much like to thank my two guests, Eliana Johnson and Meghan McCain. And thank you. You can find me on nationalreview.com or on Twitter X at Noah C. Rothman. We will see you next week.